Welcome to In the Oil Patch, presented by Shale Magazine, broadcasting today from Agreco Studios. Agreco, powering the Permian. In the Oil Patch is where, together, we explore topics that affect us all in oil, gas, business, and in your community. Every week, your host, Kym Bolado, will visit with the movers and shakers in this fast-paced industry. You'll hear from industry experts, elected officials, and many more right here on In the Oil Patch.
And now it's time to welcome on our guest, Tom Tamarkin, who is with Energy Site. Tom, welcome to In the Oil Patch Radio Show.
Okay, very good to be with you, Kym, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, today is going to be an important topic. We're going to talk about climate change. So before we get started with this very difficult conversation and a good understanding of what's really happening, I'd like to open up by asking you to tell our audience and us a little bit more about you and what makes you an expert in this field.
Well, yes, thank you. I have been studying the climate for about 15 years, and over the course of the last 10 years, have concentrated almost specifically on the specific issue. And by studying climate, that means reading everything that I can about the subject, and of course, looking at lectures by all of the famous PhDs, et cetera, in this field. My background academically, in college, I minored in math and chemistry and have a physics major. So I'm very prepared to understand the details. And having said that, I really have to say that the preponderance of the issues surrounding climate change really surround physics and chemistry. And that's a very important concept. It's really a matter of physics.
Okay, and which is your specialty field and your degree. So now that we've gotten that established, that you're a really good person to talk on the topic, I think we can start hammering away. David, you want to start opening up with the first?
Sure, absolutely, Tom. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. This will be a great discussion, I'm sure. I have, just from my personal standpoint, sat back over the last 2 weeks and watched as our national news media organizes yet another major focused coordinated campaign to frighten everyone about climate change. They're going to call it the climate emergency now rather than climate change. And that's going to be pervasive throughout our media and politics for the next, I don't know how many years. So I guess let's start with climate change. With all this discussion around it, in your view, does climate change really exist?
Well, climate change does exist, but we have to understand the fact that the Earth is over 4.5 billion years old. And by way of example, the Grand Canyon gives us a great snapshot of about 10% of that geological record. So if we think about that, modern man is trying to use a 50 to 100 year time frame to show, if not prove, that man-made climate change exists. But the fact of the matter is that's only 0.00001% of the age of the Earth.
How many zeros was that?
Five
zeros. Okay.
Five
Sorry.
zeros in front of the one. But in any geological samples show that the Earth has been much warmer and much colder in the past. And our current CO2 level is actually very low compared to many times in the past. We can prove that the climate does change due to natural variations in solar and planetary motions, coupled with the almost 24-degree tilt of the Earth on its axis, its obliquity, the elliptical orbit around the sun, and the precession of the Earth over very long periods of time.
No wonder nobody really understands this topic. It's obviously very complicated. And so when you think about this topic, I mean, how do you, Tom, I want to talk about this radiated green gas theory too, but before we move on to it, so David, you mentioned earlier that we've got the media coming out with another new campaign on this is a crisis now occurring. And I know we've had many discussions on the show about how this discussion, and I call it rhetoric as well, is leading to a real problem with parents not being able to really speak to their children on this topic, because obviously it's a very complicated topic. And it's also scaring the hell out of our children to the point where we're seeing upticks in suicides and things. So, my question for you guys is, how much do you think this is going to continue to spiral out of control until, somebody, I guess the average American person starts understanding that, it's in constant flux. So, we shouldn't really be talking to this degree because it may or may not be as true as they're saying. And I guess it's not really a question I was asking anyone. It's more of just my opinion that we're going to have another spike probably in these children and their suicide rates because, it's a difficult topic. However, I'm going to do one shameless plug for us, which one of our writers, Melissa Nichols, has wrote a book for about an 8 to a 12-year-old for parents to read to their children to help them understand climate change. And all you have to do is go to shalemag.com or look for it on Amazon. But I do encourage our listeners who might be struggling with that topic to go and look at the book, and it kind of breaks it down. We're going to go to break. When we come back from break, I want to get on the topic of, what's actually causing, you've explained all the dynamics, but what is this radiated greenhouse gas theory? We'll break that down. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest today is Tom Tamarkin, the president of Energy Site. Tom, before the break, this show is really going to be geared at having a true discussion on what is climate change and trying to break it down for the average person to really understand what is going on. Let's talk about this radiated greenhouse gas theory. What is it? Is this the problem with climate change?
Yes, but I would like to pick up perhaps at the end of the conversation on your concept of children and the suicide rate and some of those other issues that are very important. But let's continue, if you will. As I said earlier, many natural events occur that create changes in climate. Things like volcanic eruptions, meteor strikes, atmospheric oscillations such as El Nino and La Nina, they all create temporary conditions in the climate, if you will, but really they should be termed weather changes, not climate. So we cannot really prove that greenhouse gases trapping heat cause measurable amounts of warmth on the Earth. All of these climate change predictions that you hear about in the media, and certainly we've heard about quite recently, I think on Earth Day, President Biden delivered a major speech, delivered around the world with other people. But these theories are all unproven theories based on computer models. And going back all the way to 1988 in the first hearings by Congress, every prediction made has been proven false. Very important point. Now you asked about the radiated greenhouse gas theory. The infrared radiated gas theory is really based on the absorption of infrared radiation, which is a fancy term for heat, which is reflected back from the Earth by these greenhouse gases, such as water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane gas. Methane gas, of course, in Texas, you hear about it coming from cows. Yeah. The fact of the matter is, methane is such a small greenhouse gas that we shouldn't even be talking about it. In the mid-1800s, my great-grandfather, Sir Thomas Thorpe, along with Henry Roscoe in the UK, they made the first accurate calculations of just how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere. And later that century, a gentleman named Savant Arrhenius and another gentleman named John Tyndall and a few others proposed that these greenhouse gases actually trap heat in the air. In the early 20th century, Max Planck developed a modern understanding of quantum mechanics, and Karl Schwarzschild applied this understanding to greenhouse gases. And together they showed us just how these gases behave and why. They do, in fact, absorb the heat, the infrared radiation, but they dissipate it very quickly. In fact, in 10,000 billionths of a second, a lot of zeros. That's called a femtosecond in physics, or 1 to the minus 15 zeros. And they transfer that energy to surrounding molecules, mostly nitrogen and oxygen. Then that energy is radiated out with what we call a three-dimensional Stradian pulse. Most of the energy passes to outer space, and either directly or through convection. Now,
This is- Go ahead, Tom.
no, I was just going to say that no corresponding increase in temperature can be measured, and that's an important point, can be measured on the
Yeah.
Earth. Any increase in temperature in the atmosphere, the majority gases being nitrogen and oxygen, they also rise to space due to what we call the pseudo-adiabatic expansion and convection. So bottom line, no measurable amount of warmth is actually transferred to the Earth. You feel the temperature of a rock, it's not warmer than that rock was, 5 years ago at the same point in time.
So that's so fascinating to me. We can't measure this, and yet the entire climate change theory is based on this, correct? And their computer models that create all the alarm out in the public are based on this theory, correct?
Yes.
So,
No one has been able to.
We're all like, okay, look, guys, let's go to break. We're going to come back and hit this topic again because I want to talk about also President Biden addressed a summit, and there was a lot of doom and gloom there too. You're listening to an Oil Patch Radio Show. We'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to an Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest today is a very important guest. His name is Tom Tamarkin. He actually is the president of Energy Site and is also a physicist by his academia education. Tom, before the break, we were talking about climate change and these greenhouse gases that everyone talks about. David, I know you have a question here. Jump on in here, buddy.
well, yeah, as we were closing the last segment, Tom, you were talking about the fact that this supposed warming of the earth, change in the climate, and the impacts from man-made CO2, our instruments are, even in this advanced day in the 21st century, are unable to actually measure any actual heating of the earth from this theory. And, on Earth Day this year, President Biden hosted a video summit, I guess it was, with over 600 participants globally, at which they all chimed in, world leaders from around the world, including China, which isn't doing anything really to curb their emissions, participated in this and talked about all the things they're doing or not doing to address climate change. And I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that right now.
Okay, but there is one important point I want to finish up regarding how we have measured or have been unable to measure climate change.
Sure.
And again, I have to repeat this. Nobody has been able to empirically measure and prove any temperature increases on the Earth due to these greenhouse gases. What the greenhouse gases do is that they can delay cooling. Without these greenhouse gases, at nighttime, as an example, we would get down to 100 degrees below zero in the morning, but they don't create measurable increases in temperature on the Earth. So that's a very important point. Now, regarding President Biden and the current administration and other administrations around the world, I would go so far as to say that President Biden's level of understanding of science is probably in the 8th grade to 12th grade area, if that. And given his advanced age, he's probably forgotten most of his early science. He's certainly not a science major in school. So he is being spoon-fed what other people want him to believe, and really need to follow the trail of the money, because this is about a $2.5 trillion a year boondoggle with regard to the renewable energy. And that really is what's driving the climate. Now, that kind of fell into the trap, if you will, of the IPCC and the various conferences on climate. But once again, it's being driven by the economies, and we have to also bring into play carbon taxes. Governments around the world are raising a great deal of money by exercising these carbon taxes. The fact that they have no value and that they don't really do anything for mankind except hurt it, they simply don't understand. But it's an economic issue, not a scientific issue.
Another buzzword, Tom, is carbon dioxide. And a lot of scientists, certainly the media, many politicians, say that this, perceived climate change comes from specifically fossil fuels and that they emit this carbon dioxide. Tell me, is that your opinion too? Are they correct on this?
Oh, absolutely not. And in fact, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. We all agree on that. But it's a trace amount. By trace amount one, I mean that it really accounts for only 0.04% of all gases in the atmosphere. And it only accounts for 4% of all the greenhouse gases. Water vapor by far is the largest greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
Water vapor, of course, being clouds and evaporation from the ocean. But we really shouldn't focus on carbon dioxide per se. We need to focus on man-made carbon dioxide coming from, as you said, fossil fuels, because that's the premise of the whole man-made climate change argument, if you will. So contrary to popular belief, and really that by many scientists, the anthropogenic percentage of carbon dioxide is so low in comparison to the total amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we simply can't measure it. It's unmeasurable. Now, we have to note over the course of the last year, worldwide across all energy sectors, we've dropped the use of fossil fuels by about 30% because of COVID-19. But
Right.
during this major decrease in man-made carbon dioxide generation, it simply has not been measured by the standard reporting graphs and curves. And we actually have on our website, which is Climate Site, spelled climatecite.com, a section on our position of CO2. And in the first 3 paragraphs, we actually go through the dynamics of what I just said. Understanding, of course, that over the last 30 years, worldwide, we've increased energy use, fossil fuel use in bits and spats here and there. But the increase in carbon dioxide simply does not track that. Dr. Murray Salby confirms this and explains the details in a lecture on our website. And Dr. Jamal Munshi, who is a well-known leading statistician, he shows us that the likelihood of carbon dioxide increases affecting the temperature of the Earth is about as likely as one of you two spotting a UFO at the end of this show.
Oh.
Now, having
We're
said
probably
that,
not going to find that. We're not
yeah,
going
go
to
outside and look for that UFO. But having said that, the Earth has gotten much greener over the last 30 years because
Right.
CO2 levels have increased. And that does a number of good things, like providing increased crop yields, and definitely it's a good thing for livestock production. CO2 is a good thing to have more of, not less.
Well, it's plant food. I mean, it's the basis, the entire basis for life on planet Earth, correct? I mean, we're a
All
carbon.
life forms on Earth are carbon-based.
Yeah.
This is, it seems like we're getting ready to go to break, guys. When we come back, I want to get back on this topic, but it just seems like to me, we talked about this is a $2 trillion, are we marching to the globalist expansion? I don't know, but it's shocking to me to see that all these countries are participating in this discussion on that we have this crisis, and yet we're discussing that there is just no scientific model. So to the listeners, you're saying, but that can't be so because there's all these scientists that say this, and our government is saying this, and other governments all over the world are saying this. How can they all be saying this when it's not accurate and true? So when we come back from break, I do want to kind of pick up that topic. What is the game plan here for us? And why are they saying these things? And why are scientists not coming out against it? Why are there a lot of scientists that are lining up for it? We got to take a quick break. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest today is Tom Tumarkin, president of Energy Site. We're discussing climate change. Is it real? And David, you and I, we've had a lot of discussions on climate change and what's behind the position of a lot of different political elected officials, if you will. But Tom, we've seen President Biden take a much stronger stance on climate change. And David, you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of media hype on now we're going into an emergency climate change, which is troubling. Your opinion, why are we, I know you talked about this $2 trillion, but it seems crazy to think that the whole entire world is in on this. And scientists are not coming forward and saying we have no models that can prove this or disprove this. Where is this going? Because if this is a worldwide uh, PR campaign, it appears. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, I should point out the fact that recently in Shale Magazine, there's a major article, a feature article, if you will, on climate change that I wrote actually. And there's an extended interview of probably an hour and 15 minutes that's included in that article. And it goes into a lot of these details that might just be beyond the scope of this conversation today. But in direct answer to your question, there are many scientists around the world, and indeed here in the US, that know that the probability of man creating this change in climate, as Dr. Munchie said, it's about as likely as spotting a UFO. However, these are not the scientists that are currently being paid by the government or through universities to get subsidies and gifts from philanthropists and from other ties to the government. In other words, it's the wrong group of people that currently have the media and the ability to speak out. But let's get back, if we can, to your question about carbon dioxide. And I think someone, David, asked me specifically, he commented about my comment about the majority of carbon dioxide not coming from mankind. Right. So where does this carbon dioxide come from? Well, it actually comes from two primary sources, animals and volcanic eruptions, animals being by far the larger of those two sources. All animals, as we said a minute ago, are carbon-based, and even fish in the ocean produce carbon dioxide. Even bacteria on land produces carbon dioxide. So that leads into the obvious question Kym alluded to, which is why have we seen a steady rise of carbon dioxide recorded over the last 50 years? And as I said earlier, various CO2 monitoring stations simply don't have the sensitivity, that they do not have the ability to determine where that carbon dioxide comes from, if it's from man. The primary reason that we've seen measurable increases in the total amount of carbon dioxide relates to the fact that we have been coming out of the little ice age over the last 100 years. And coming out of that ice age has, of course, caused the oceans to warm up by a couple of degrees. You really need to understand, people need to understand the fact that the ocean contains roughly 50 to 60 times more dissolved carbon dioxide than the atmosphere. And this ratio is called the partition ratio, and it's the function of something called Henry's law. And as the temperature of the oceans increase, more carbon dioxide is liberated or released by the oceans as a function of Henry's law and its temperature coefficient. It's a fundamental law, it's not a theory. As water body temperatures go up, the amount of liberated CO2 levels go up. Now, regarding how much of this anthropogenic or man-made climate change notion can be put to rest, I think that's a very good topic that we should address here momentarily. But let me give you catch up.
But just a quick question. So if the majority of the additional CO2 is being released by the oceans, what is the utility of all these policies in the Green New Deal that would have us stop driving automobiles, have us stop flying in airplanes, and instead go around the country on trains? How is that really addressing anything real? Is it? I mean, is it addressing anything real that's actually a problem?
The simple answer is no, none, no effect whatsoever. It has a negative effect. Part of it is a wish, if you will, of many governments worldwide to force a unified world government, perhaps under the UN control. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to limit energy. That's probably a big key to the problem. But I don't think that any politicians, certainly our administration as a prime example, really understand all of the ramifications. They simply don't understand the science involved, and they don't understand where energy comes from.
It almost appears that they don't also even care to find out. It's just
Uh,
everybody's mind has been made up. And yet, you know, if I'm going to change the gears just a little bit, but David, remind me of how many coal power plants China is bringing on, and is China and coal plants hurting the planet? Well, how many are they bringing on, David? Or Tom?
Well, I don't know what their current rate is. For a long time, they were bringing on a new one every week. And India is too. India is building them at a very rapid pace.
About this.
80%. I know. I saw a statistic. I think it was from the IPCC actually, that 80% of all the increase in man-made carbon contributions over the last decade has come from China and India. Tom, does that square with the information you have?
Well, no, that's exactly right. I've been to China 12 times, and
Yeah.
I've been done business as well. And so I can testify firsthand as to how many coal plants have gone online in China over that period of time. And I can tell you that the pollution, the dirty air in China is very bad.
Yeah.
All the carbon, because they don't filter the air as we do here in the United States with particulate removal with electrostatic precipitators and the like. But the fact of the matter is, getting back to the Paris-China Accords, China and India are basically let off the hook in terms of having to meet any additional new standards. Yet, an important point, the majority of the solar panels that are shipped and wind generation equipment that is shipped in this $2.5 trillion a year boondoggle, the green energy scheme, if not scam, comes from China.
Jesus.
And I
Christ.
think, and
It's
I think
shocking how they have the world.
China is probably governing the U.S. and our policy position to drastically weaken the United States and weaken our national security so that they can become the preeminent power of the world. That's my personal opinion.
Well, we're going to end this segment with a bang, because that's all the time we have for this show. Tom, I'd like to thank you for coming on to the show, and we look forward to having you back. And now, David, it's time for us to bring on our guest, Tom Tamarkin, who is the president of Energy Site. And we're continuing the conversation we had last week on climate change and is it real?
Yes, absolutely. And Tom, thank you for being with us again. I urge everyone to go take a look at the podcast of our previous show with Tom, because we talked at great length about climate change theory and the issues surrounding that, and why a lot of things we're being told here in the United States about climate change and its causes are really not true. And you can find that podcast at iHeartRadio, Vindy Oil Patch Radio at iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and several other locations.
ShaleMag.com.
ShaleMag.com. And so please do take a look at it, because this is going to be a continuation of that discussion. Tom, let's start by talking about carbon dioxide. We talked about this in the last segment of the last show, but we didn't get all the way through it. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your views on why the environmental community is so focused on carbon dioxide, and whether any of their concerns surrounding carbon dioxide are actually legitimate.
Well, yes, thank you. The environmental community per se is a very amorphous concept, if you will.
It certainly is.
Need to dig into that a bit. A friend of mine, a colleague, I work with him actually as an advisor to a group that we are very close to in Europe, is Patrick Moore, who is co-founder of Greenpeace.
Right.
And Patrick, as an example, has reversed his previous position about global warming and even carbon dioxide. and I think makes the point in saying that almost all of these people are not scientists, but they're activists.
Right.
So they really don't know, to be blunt, they simply do not understand the science that they're talking about. They're ignorant of the science.
Isn't
So
this more of kind of a religious exercise with these folks than a climate or a scientific endeavor with most of these people?
It's very much a religion. We call
Yeah.
it a climatology. Very good point. But they have a religious attitude, so they don't question any of the underlying facts. They simply recite it, book and verse.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. It's almost cultish-like behavior. But anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead
No.
and talk about carbon dioxide and your views
Well,
on that.
as I said a minute ago, and I can't overemphasize this point, very, very few people, I mentioned Dr. Murray Selby as an example, have really asked the key question. I'm one of the few that has written about this over the last 3 years. In fact, I wrote a chapter in a book, which I think you may have seen a copy of, which really discusses this in detail, and it has some graphs that I was the first to produce, actually showing things such as specific volcanic eruptions and the effect that they had on temperature over the course of the following years, as well as other issues. And in that article, I mentioned the fact that we simply were unable to measure the increases of CO2 coming from the use of fossil fuels as more and more fossil fuels were being used worldwide in the developing countries. And as I said, very few people have asked that question. I know many of the leading scientists, if you will, who are on what we call the skeptical side of the theory of global warming. And I can't think of any of them. I'm not going to mention names here, but as I said, I know all of them, but not all of them. I can't think of anybody who has really dug deeply into this concept of just how much of this carbon dioxide in our atmosphere actually comes from the use of fossil fuels. And I'll explain why here in just a couple of minutes.
Can I ask a question that I'm sure our listeners are wondering too? So we have all of these, we have the Paris Climate Accord. That was a very big deal with President Trump, a very big deal with Biden as well. And we have all these countries that are wanting to participate in it, but they are also, like you said, 20 to 30 years down the road from ever having to comply like the United States needs to comply like yesterday. Are these same countries also involved in the $2 trillion swindle, scare the hell out of everyone in the world that we're on a collision course? I mean, how are all of these countries tying into this to keep this unprovable fact, if you will? How are they doing this? And I know we have a complicit media for sure, but surely there's some people out on the planet that are smart and intelligent and questioning what's happening here. This is not why is this happening? And why is no one saying anything? How are they connected, these different countries?
Well, it was not a big deal with President Trump. President Trump said, basically, let's abandon our position in the Paris Climate Accords. In other words, exit, and he did. And it was President Biden who, on the first day of assuming office, issued an executive order. Now, that's only an executive order, and it requires a lot of steps in order to approve it. But nonetheless, it's President Biden who wants to re-enter the Paris Climate Accords. Now, getting back to Shale Magazine and Shale website, I in fact wrote an article about why we should exit the Paris Climate Accords. And I would really kind of urge your readers, and perhaps you could have that article about exiting the Paris Climate Accords highlighted on your website, because it's important. But there are a lot of issues to it that, again, come from what we call media hype. Now, I've listened to David in the past in other interviews make comments recently last week with Jason, stating that we really haven't had increases in hurricanes, increases in tornadoes, and even increases in temperature for the last 15 years as a function of climate change. We, in fact, have had better weather conditions. Yet, when you look at the Paris Climate Accords, it's all rested on the predicate that we have had more of these dangerous weather events, which is hype. It's
Nonsense. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And just telling our listeners, because we're going to take a quick break. So this was a show that we did a couple of weeks back with Jason Modulin, president of the Alliance Taking Live Calls, in which, David, you had brought that up. So I do encourage our listeners to go back and listen.
Well, I
to
think
our
that was
podcast.
all in response to the call Tom made into the show and asked the question, right?
Correct. Yes. Okay. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Oil Patch Radio program. I'm David Blackman, editor of Shale Magazine, with my co-host Kym Bolado, and our special guest today, Tom Tamarkin. Tom Tamarkin, excuse me, who has his own website, climatesite.com, and is an expert on climate change and all the hype around it. Tom, so let's talk about, how do we get past this? I mean, is there any way to kind of put to rest this notion that man-made carbon dioxide is this climate boogeyman that's causing the Earth's climate to go crazy? I mean, which obviously isn't happening. So how do we educate the public and kind of put that notion to rest?
Well, yes, great question. Two tasks. One, we have to educate the public. And two, we have to exercise our political leaders. And I'm not really sure which is going to come first.
Yeah.
But if I were a strong and honest politician, member of the Senate, Ted Cruz as an example, and I wanted to end this debate once and for all, I would simply hold a Senate hearing and I would deliver an opening statement wherein I would define the problem as follows, the climate change problem. Does man-made carbon dioxide come from fossil fuels create warming? And the answer to that simple question really solves this issue once and for all. So we can forget about all the physics about absorbed infrared radiation and heat transfer. That's really too pedantic for the average person and even certainly the average politician to understand. Now, if we look at a recent paper from Dr. Will Happer of the CO2 Coalition, which we recently posted on our website, you have to have a master's degree, if not a PhD in physics, to understand that paper. But the issue can really be boiled down to that simple question: does man-made carbon dioxide cause warming or climate change on the Earth? And note, I didn't say does carbon dioxide cause global warming. Right. I said does man-made carbon dioxide cause warming? And if you ask that question in this hypothetical Senate hearing, with numerous scientists present and lots of left aisle types, cronies of Michael Mann, the professor in his hockey stick curve, I would pose to them one final question. And that is, can anybody here in this group prove mathematically, scientifically, empirically, that increases from man's anthropogenic carbon dioxide compose X amount, some number of the total amount of carbon dioxide? In other words, just how much of the total carbon dioxide does man generate? And I think what you'd find is total silence, and then probably somebody would say something to the effect of, "Sir, Mr. Cruz, we need to study that for a while."
Well, I mean, exactly. That's what the show has been about, is how complicated it is. If you don't have these degrees, you probably shouldn't really be putting an opinion in here, because your opinion is probably not even accurate, much less you understand what's going on. And yet our elected officials, all due respect to them, are really pushing out this messaging going along with it. And it's just it's dangerous. And there's a lot of reasons why we need to stay energy strong in the United States, stay in front of this instead of being the leader, instead of being behind it. It's just, my question, but it's a great idea. And you know what? We should be reaching out to Ted Cruz and asking him, well, why aren't you doing that? Especially being from Texas. And Texas is having to do a whole lot of entering a whole lot of pieces of legislation, if you will, to try to protect our industry, right, David? We just had this discussion on the show,
Sure.
2 weeks ago of
Yeah.
what's happening because there's such anti-oil and gas, sediment out there, and Texas has got to figure out a way to protect its industry and, its state's income, if you will. When we get back from break, we're continuing the conversation of climate change and is it real? You're listening to an Oil Patch Radio Show, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. I'm David Blackman with my co-host Kym Bolado and our special guest today, Tom Tamark. And Tom, as we ended the last segment, we were in the middle of our discussion about carbon dioxide and whether man-made carbon dioxide is, causing all this climate change that we are supposedly undergoing. And I know you had another point you wanted to make, so I wanted to give you the chance to do that before we move to another subject.
Well, I think that's really the key because as I've mentioned here 3 or 4 times before, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is easily measured. We do that, and most people have seen the famous graph coming from what's called the Keeling curve from Mauna Loa observation point. But that really needs some explanation. If you look at that graph, that famous graph, and it shows the 45-degree axis tilting upward, understand that that's parts per million. So what they are showing is 280 parts per million going up to 415 roughly parts per million over the last 50 years. Parts per million is extremely small. So what they've done is they've taken the curve that should be a flat line, but they've expanded the vertical axis so greatly that they can actually show the difference of 2/200ths of a million over a 50-year period of time. That's absurd. It's a very disingenuous use of math and statistics and graphics, but it's one that has been done by the IPCC and by all of the what we call climate alarmists. So we really have to get down to, again, the issue that the amount of man-produced carbon dioxide simply has not been measured. And we have to ask the obvious question, why? And the reason is really quite simple. The spectrometry, which is a fancy word for measurement of equipment, used at Mauna Loa and other stations monitoring CO2. This equipment has to operate at the very highest levels of its sensitivity in what we call a nonlinear range. And what we refer to as signal to noise ratio in that range is so large that it simply cannot filter out the difference between background effects and man's use of CO2, believe it or not. We can actually, when you look at this curve, you see what we call a red sine wave. You could refer to it as shark's teeth going up and down. That is in fact the variations of seasonal plant growth in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So it's sensitive enough that we can determine variations in plant growth, but it's simply not sensitive enough to determine how much fuel, how much carbon dioxide man is producing due to his use of fuel. Nobody thinks to ask that very simple question.
Yeah, and so another simple question, I think, it has to do with the Paris Accords, and you talked about that a little bit ago, and your belief we should be out of them as we were throughout the Trump administration. Absolutely. Isn't it a fact? You know, another thing that the climate change community likes to demonize is hydraulic fracturing. But isn't it a reality, number one, that the United States has already met its goals under the Paris Climate Accords through 2025? And two, that the main reason we've been able to do that is because of hydraulic fracturing and all the natural gas we've been able to produce and replace coal-fired power plants with?
Well, you just brought up another very good buzzword, which nobody on the street, the average person on the street, has any idea what it means. But the key is hydraulic. What is hydraulic? Well, that means something driven by water pressure. So
Right.
what we basically do is that we pump water into an existing well or even new wells, and we simply accelerate or increase the flow of oil by pushing it out with water. Now, we can add certain chemicals to that water to make the flow easier, but it's a very harmless procedure. And I think I've seen a statistic that says that probably 60 or 70% of all oil wells now in the United States use some form of hydraulic
Yeah.
fracking. Fracking comes from fracturing, meaning we break down big rocks into littler rocks and making it more porous so more oil can flow. That has nothing to do with climate change. It has everything to do with increasing our supply of energy and maintaining the United States' supremacy in the supply of energy and our national security based on a robust economy and budget. And I think that's really what we're trying to tear down, if they've even thought about it. But again, I propose that most people that talk about fracturing, and certainly President Biden in his debates, he simply didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't understand the concept.
No, he doesn't.
Well, you know what? I
That's
think it
pretty
has to
clear.
do with the name, guys. Like, if whoever is naming these things for the average person doesn't understand it, they should be naming it something like, these are nice, soft, warm puppies. And everybody would love it. You know, it's the wording that they've demonized it as well without anybody even understanding the practice. You're absolutely right. And that's why fracking's got such a bad name. We need to rename it soft, cute little puppies, and everybody would not have a problem with it. We're getting ready to go to break. This will be our last opportunity to close down the topic of climate change. And so I want us in the next segment to really talk about what can we do to try to start addressing it and talking to the general public about, we've got a big train wreck coming. And parents, if you're listening, you know, we definitely want you to have an opportunity to understand a little bit more so you can talk to your children about it, because this topic is not going to go away anytime soon. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. David, my co-host, and I have a great opportunity to interview Tom Tamarkin, who is the president of Energy Site. Tom, we've had two shows pertaining to climate change. Is it real? Breaking it down for people to understand what does climate change really mean, since we know that the media is pushing out a new message, which is it's now energy emergency time, if you will. I just have a question, like, how in the world do we start having discussions, real discussions on the information you gave us today to tell, you know, the American people that it's time to wake up and see what's happening here? What steps are you planning on taking, and what can we do to try to help bring this conversation out and now start talking truthful information instead of a dog and pony show, which is what's been happening?
Well, another great question. Getting back to your statement before the break, we need to rename fracking to something like water-propelled oil drilling. Maybe puppies is not the answer, but certainly water-driven drilling. Water is pretty safe. But anyway, having said that, and that gets back to education, because again, the average person doesn't understand hydraulic fracking or hydraulic fracturing. But getting back to carbon dioxide and getting back to climate change, as I said, there is no man-driven climate change, period, end of discussion. How can we prove that? It's difficult because it's such a complex subject, but if we would simply focus on that concept of carbon dioxide, how much of the entire carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from man's use of fossil fuel? That's a difficult question to answer because of the technical issues I brought up a minute ago, having to do with the signal to noise ratio and the measurementation. But actually, we're working on solving that. Currently, I'm working with a group of scientists and mathematicians, and we're in the process of developing, I'd say that we have developed on paper, the means to solve the signal to noise ratio problem. to where we will be able to actually empirically measure the amount of CO2 man produces. And we actually do this using a technique which we call quantum resonance interferometry. Fancy term, we abbreviate it as QRI. I'm not going to go into the scientific details of how QRI works here, but we do have a section on our website which actually explains this. And using this technique of QRI analysis, we should be able to fairly quickly determine just what that number is, the percentage of man-made CO2. And our initial calculations, not using QRI, but simply using data coming from NOAA and NASA, tells us that it's somewhere in the area of, and David will love this, 0.0019, two zeros.
Just two zeros, yeah.
Two zeros versus 0.0059% of the total amount of CO2 comes from man, from the use of fossil fuels. But our goal is to actually prove this up with the initial results in a peer-reviewed paper by the end of this year. So that's a very important point. And then in terms of other steps, it really gets down to education. I mentioned the fact that I've written several articles in Shale Magazine, one on energy in the previous edition, and one more recent on climate change. And it's currently, Kym mentioned Melissa Nichols' book on climate change for children. These steps are very important. We really need to prove once and for all that climate change is not science. Climate change driven by man is not science, but rather it's nonsense. Now, probably most importantly, and I want to kind of hit this point, is that I'm directing a team that's actually writing a full-length action-packed movie to teach people about the fraud and deception, which we call man-made climate change. So that's a pretty blunt statement. It's fraud, deception, and it's called man-made climate change. It's actually the biggest lie man has ever committed, ever committed on mankind, climate change. And we really need to teach how to try to bankrupt countries and destroy future generations for generations to come. And the movie will actually feature leading PhDs to explain the science, the real science, but in kind of subliminal, easy to understand ways that are not pedantic and easy to understand by the average person who may have taken a high school science class, but certainly not classes in physics and chemistry. And the key word is it's an action-packed thriller movie with a very fun and interesting plot. And we hope to begin filming this movie within the next calendar year and to release it within 2 years before the next election.
That would be great. And it's going to be called Mango, the movie? Right?
It's called Mango the Movie. And of course, the obvious question, what's a mango? Well, it's a fruit. Why is the movie named Mango? Well, again, I refer you to our climate site website, because we have both the through line and plot of the movie published, as well as the history behind the mango concept. It's an interesting story, and it gets down to something that I'm sure the two of you can appreciate. I lived in Texas, and we called it common sense.
Yeah. Let's try using that.
Mango is about common sense.
But you know what? Honestly, I think that the solution that you are trying to do to get the word out, if everybody does a little bit, I think together we can start changing the perception, especially here in the United States. So I'm very excited to see that you're doing that movie. I'm also very excited to see that movie and to push it out. But we all need to do our part to get informed and educated, not just for ourselves, but for our country, for our children. And that being said, I understand it's a topic that's very complicated. And to be honest with you, I don't have all the answers for it either. But I do want to listen to people who have the education to back up their science and what they're saying. And when we hear stuff come out from our government and from people who are making billions of dollars, like the Al Gores of the world, you know, they don't back any science. They just say things And it's so negative to our population, to our people, in saying that AOC, we've got 12 years, Biden, we're on a path to no return. These things scare people that don't even understand the topic. And I think that we should consider getting informed and trying to do our part. But Tom, before we leave you, give us your website where listeners can go to and follow you and look up your work and see that you're like the real deal. Go ahead. What site can they go to?
Well, again, I want to reinforce the point that, and I'm sitting here looking at it, I just published an article today by Larry Hamlin on the Energy and Natural Resources United States Senate meeting held in June of 1988. Absolutely none of the predictions given in that Senate hearing have happened. And talking about Al Gore, well, I was coming back from Reno, Nevada over a 7,000 foot pass a couple of weeks ago and got stuck in a snowstorm. They closed down I-80. So I'm sorry, Mr. Gore, but yes, we still have snow. Yet famously, Al Gore said that after 2020 something, it would stop snowing in the United States.
Right.
Our website is Climate Site, and that's spelled climatecite.com. And getting back to the concept I mentioned about the current science that we're doing with respect to our work in the mathematics and the physical measurementation to just once and for all prove the amount of anthropogenic carbon dioxide. We are basically doing this as a group of independent scientists, PhDs, mathematicians, and concerned people with our own money on our own time. I say that because Climate Site has been formed as a 501c3. And if anybody is interested in becoming a benefactor or patron and helping us with this project, I can't think of anything that's more important to our country and really to the world. Very important project, and it's one that has a very short time horizon, meaning months, not years.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, thank you. And once again, that is climatesite.com. And here's a final thought. You should write an article for Shale Magazine pointing out all the things that Al Gore said were going to happen that have not happened. And we'll publish that too. Anyway, thanks, Tom, for being a guest on today's show. David, as always, it was a pleasure catching up with you. Thank you for hosting the show with me today. That's all the time we have. And thank you for listening to an Oil Patch Radio Show.